There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store.
And you have to know that the news of John's death affected Jesus, where he would want to get alone and away with his disciples. Because all these guys, they were friends. They all knew each other. And John was Jesus's cousin. And so now they take this boat and they go to a deserted place. But when you take a boat on the Lake of Galilee, the crowd, they can see where the boat's going. And so what they do is they all run along the shoreline to get to the area that they're headed. And so we read this and it looks like Jesus is alone and he's with his disciples and he just kind of suddenly turns around and the crowd, they're all there. And Jesus, he doesn't consider what he's going through. And he has compassion on all these people. And that word compassion here means to have one's inner being stirred, which is stronger than just saying he had sympathy. And this term is also used of Jesus 8 times in the gospel. So now Jesus, he spends the rest of the day healing the sick until evening. And evening back then was between 3 and 6. And so it's getting pretty late for them to go out and to get some dinner. But it really isn't too late to send them away because there's villages around and there's more than one village because it says villages. And so there's places to get food and nobody was really expecting Jesus to provide the dinner. And these disciples, they've had a long day and they've had the news of John's death and then they've traveled by boat and now they've been helping Jesus minister to these people all day. And you have to remember, there's about 15,000 to 20,000 people there. And there's a time when company has stayed too long and you're tired. And though you're concerned about these people, you're also concerned about getting your own dinner and your own rest. And so at their suggestion of sending the crowd away, I'm sure the last thing that entered their mind is that Jesus would say to them, you give them something to eat. But he did. And Jesus said, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And you kind of have to admire that they didn't say that they wouldn't, or they didn't say that they couldn't, and that they actually start to try to figure out how to give them some food. And they tell Jesus to go, well, we don't have enough bread, and we don't have enough money. What can we do? Because here, Jesus is asking them to do something that is impossible. And then when they told Jesus what they did have, and they told him that Andrew had swiped some little boy's lunch, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And these loaves, they weren't big loaves of bread. These are just biscuits. And they're biscuits and they're made out of barley. And barley was the food for poor people. Barley was a common food to feed animals. And so he had these 5 biscuits and these fish. And these fish, they were just sardines. They were either like dried or they were pickled. And so what you have here is you really don't have much more than maybe 2 filet-o-fish sandwiches. And then Jesus said, bring them here to me. And the thing is that Jesus, he asks us to do these same types of things all the time. He asks us to do things that are impossible. And we go and we say, well, but we don't have enough money and we don't have enough resources. And a lot of times we just say, well, we can't. And so we don't even try. But like here, Jesus isn't asking the disciples to do the miracle. Jesus is going to do the miracle. He's just asking them to bring the little that they have and to be willing to do what he asks. And that's all we're required to do, to bring the little we have and to be obedient and to trust Jesus to do the work that he's commanding us to do. And so we know, because it says that there's about 5,000 men, which means with women and children, there's like 15,000 to 20,000 people there. And we know from the other Gospels that Jesus has the crowd sit down into groups of 50s and hundreds. So Jesus is putting these people in order so they can be fed, so that nobody gets missed. Because if it was just a big crowd and just trying to feed a whole big crowd, people would get missed. And so this is like having the disciples waiting on big tables of people, tables of 50s and hundreds, and which I would think would be just a miracle in itself that 12 men could serve about 150 to 300 tables. But this miracle, where it occurs, it actually occurs in Jesus' hands. And as he looks to heaven and he gives thanks, which is where we get the idea of saying our prayers before we eat a meal, he begins breaking the bread. And he just keeps breaking it and breaking it and breaking it. And he's not making a bunch of crumbs. He's filling baskets with bread and fish. And all the disciples, they have to do is distribute them. So they're distributing the food that Jesus is creating. And they kept feeding him and feeding him and feeding him until the people could eat no more. And the word that's translated to be filled actually means to be glutted. And that's where we actually get our word gluttony from, until they can't eat another bite. So everybody out there, they overate. But because God is never wasteful, they pick up all the leftovers. And it's not crumbs, it's pieces of bread. And what amazes me is that it says that they pick up exactly 12 baskets. And some people will say, well, that's because there's 12 disciples. And so after the meal, they're all going to get a basket of bread. But what amazes me is that with so many people, like say up to 20,000 people, how come they don't have like 120 baskets or 500 baskets? How come it's only 12? And this miracle, this is the only miracle that's been recorded in all four of the Gospels beside the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And so now the meal's over, and Jesus, he's hurrying to get the disciples into a boat to send them away. And he's going to try to dismiss this crowd all by himself, because we know from the other Gospels that this crowd, they now want to force Jesus to be their king. And they don't want him to be their king because they want a savior. What they're wanting is they're wanting the bread king. Because we even read the very next day, if we read in John's gospel, that they come looking for Jesus because they're looking for another meal. And he confronts them and he says, you're only following me because you want the bread. And then when Jesus, he teaches that he's the real bread from heaven and that they have to eat his body, that all these people, they all walk away from him. But the safest place for these disciples now is away from this crowd. So it's actually safer for Jesus to send his disciples into a storm than to be in this crowd, because they may have got caught up in the whole thing of making Jesus king. And so this is the second time that Jesus has sent these disciples into a storm. But this time, Jesus isn't with them. This time, Jesus isn't sleeping in the boat. And again, this is God's will for their lives. So sometimes God, he brings us into the storms. And where our safety and our well-being isn't really because of our outward circumstances. It's not because we're living these lives of peace. That the safest place for us is actually in these storms that God has created for us. And we see with these disciples, when we see this all the time, where you think, well, things could never get worse. Now we're in a storm again. We're trying to live. Oh, and so it's a long day. They're all tired, and now they're fighting a storm. And Jesus isn't even here to calm the storm this time. And then all of a sudden, you're seeing ghosts, and you're not supposed to be believing in ghosts, but you're seeing it. And what else could it be? These men, they've seen some very strange things in these last 2.5 years. And the disciples, they didn't recognize Jesus. And the reason they didn't recognize him is because they weren't looking for Jesus. So there's no way they would be thinking, well, this might be Jesus walking out to greet us. And the last time, they didn't know that Jesus could command the waves and the wind. And this time, they could have never known that Jesus could actually walk on the water until they saw it for themselves. And in Mark's gospel, it says that if they hadn't seen Jesus out there, that Jesus was really intending just to pass by. And it says that this is the fourth watch, which is in Roman time, is saying it's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. And then there's this part where I can't even get my head around it because I have no idea how Peter could even be thinking what he's asking Jesus to do, to come out to him. That never would come into my head. I would have just sat back and been scared and stunned like everybody else, just watching Jesus. Because the storm is bad enough, but to be in the storm without a boat in the middle of the sea, I couldn't even imagine that. So Peter, he has to be seeing differently. And so maybe he's seeing through the eyes of faith, and he's not really looking at his circumstances. Because we do know when he does start to look at his circumstances, his faith fails. And so when Peter asks Jesus, he says, bid me to come. He uses the Greek word for the command of a king. So Peter, he's really asking Jesus to use his authority as a king to command him to come to him. And Jesus commanded Peter, so Peter could do it. But Peter, he didn't do it very long. And it says that Peter, he looked at the wind and the sea, and the wind was boisterous. And when Jesus said to Peter, you of little faith, why did you doubt? That word for doubt there actually means standing uncertainly at two ways. So it tells you that Peter, he had a choice of which way he wanted to look at it. That he could look at it through his circumstances, or he could look at it through faith. And I don't think this is really a rebuke or much of a rebuke from Jesus, as much as it was to be an encouragement for Peter to be able to maintain his faith. Because Peter, he has to learn how to have faith in uncertain circumstances, because he's going to have those kind of circumstances for the rest of his life. And that's what God does with us through our storms, when we don't see him. And when he comes to us and he sees us in our storm, what he's doing is he's building our faith in him. That's when we learn to have faith. And if we do fail, we learn this next lesson that Peter teaches us. He says, when we don't have enough faith and our faith fails and things are wrong, he teaches us to pray. And this is probably the shortest prayer in the Bible. He says, Lord, save me, which happens to be my second most common prayer. Lord, save me. My first common prayer is, Lord, forgive me. Then comes, Lord, save me. But then when he did, and he picked him up and he brought him back in the boat. And it says that when Jesus did step into that boat, that automatically they're on the other side. But you have to remember, they were in the middle of the lake. And it told us they were 3 to 4 miles out, which is actually halfway in between. Now they're at Gennesaret, and Jesus is recognized there. And now their day starts all over. So it doesn't seem like they got a lot of rest on it, but they bring all the people and they start the day again, and they're healing all the people again. And apparently these people, because they wanted to touch Jesus's hem, so that means that they must have heard about that woman with the issue of blood that had touched his hem. And it's kind of funny where people, they only want to touch his hem instead of touch him.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.